Look, I need to tell someone about this whole situation with Alexander. And I swear, if one more person tries to act like I should have seen this coming, I might actually lose it. Anyway, make sure to hit that like button if you enjoy hearing about real relationship drama, and don't forget to subscribe if you're new here. So Alexander and I met when we were teenagers through mutual friends, and I'm not gonna lie, the guy was absolutely smitten with me from day one. I could see it in how he'd light up whenever I walked into a room, how he'd hang on every word I said, and how he'd drop everything if I needed something. Was it flattering? Obviously. Was I attracted to him? Not even close. Alexander was this nerdy, slightly awkward guy with terrible fashion sense and zero confidence around women. He had this annoying habit of trying too hard to impress me with random facts and inside jokes that weren't even funny. Meanwhile, I was getting attention from guys like Dominic. Tall, athletic, confident guys who actually made my heart race. But here's the thing about Alexander that I figured out pretty quickly. He was useful. When Dominic would flake on plans or treat me like crap, Alexander was always there with a shoulder to cry on and endless validation. He'd listen to me vent for hours about how Dominic wasn't texting me back, and he'd tell me I deserved better, while secretly hoping I'd finally see him as boyfriend material. I knew exactly what he was doing, but I let it happen because it felt good to have someone worship me like that. Alexander would bring me coffee during finals, help me with homework, and even lend me money when I was broke. He never asked for anything in return except my time and attention, which felt like a pretty good deal to me. I'd throw him just enough crumbs, a hug that lasted a little too long, calling him my best guy friend, or telling him how much he meant to me to keep him hooked. The poor guy probably thought he was playing some long game where his patience and devotion would eventually win me over. I remember when he finally worked up the courage to ask me out during our sophomore year of college, and I had to bite my tongue to keep from laughing. He'd planned this whole elaborate speech about how he'd been in love with me for years and thought we could be amazing together. I let him down as gently as possible, telling him our friendship was too important to risk. But inside, I was thinking about how pathetic it was that he'd wasted so much time pining after someone who was clearly out of his league. After that rejection, I expected him to finally get the hint and move on, but Alexander just doubled down on being the perfect friend. He'd still drop everything to help me, still listen to all my relationship drama, and still look at me like I hung the moon. It was kind of sad, but also incredibly convenient. I had Dominic for excitement and passion, and Alexander for emotional support and reliability. Why would I give up that perfect setup? I never explicitly told Alexander to wait for me or gave him false hope about us having a future together. I just didn't discourage his feelings either. If he wanted to waste his 20s being my emotional support system while I dated other people, that was his choice. I figured eventually he'd meet someone else and move on, and we could just be normal friends. But years kept passing, and Alexander kept being there, always available, always supportive, always secretly hoping. The pattern became pretty predictable over the years. I'd date some exciting guy who'd inevitably disappoint me, and Alexander would be right there to pick up the pieces. He became my constant, the one person I could count on no matter what. When Dominic and I would fight, I'd call Alexander at 2 a.m. crying, and he'd talk me through it for hours. When I needed help moving apartments, Alexander would show up with a truck and his friends. When I was broke between jobs, Alexander would loan me money that we both knew I'd never pay back. Between us, I started to see Alexander as this safety net that would always be there. He was like emotional insurance, not exciting or desirable, but reliable and always available when I needed him. The guy would literally rearrange his entire schedule if I needed something, and I got comfortable with that level of devotion. It made me feel special and important in a way that my actual relationships never did. When Dominic told me he wasn't comfortable with my friendship with Alexander, I didn't even hesitate to cut contact. Alexander's feelings weren't my responsibility, and if keeping my boyfriend happy meant putting some distance between us, that seemed like an easy choice. I moved across the country with Dominic, and Alexander just disappeared from my life. No drama, no guilt trips, just acceptance. Which honestly proved to me that he wasn't as devastated as I thought he'd be. For 8 years, I barely thought about Alexander, except for the occasional holiday text or birthday message on social media. I was living my life, dating different guys, focusing on my career, and Alexander was just this distant memory from my past. When things with Dominic finally imploded, and they did spectacularly, I found myself back home and suddenly curious about what had happened to my old friend. Reconnecting with Alexander felt like putting on a comfortable old sweater. We fell back into our old dynamic immediately, like no time had passed at all. He was still eager to listen to my problems, still supportive and understanding, still clearly harboring feelings for me that he tried to hide behind friendship. The difference was that now I was older, more jaded, and honestly pretty exhausted from years of dating men who couldn't give me what I needed. Alexander had changed, though. He'd gotten more confident, more successful, better at hiding his obvious attraction to me. He'd learned to play it cooler, but I could still see it in his eyes, that same adoration and hope that had been there 20 years ago. It was almost endearing how consistent he was. While every other man in my life had let me down or moved on, Alexander was still there, still interested, still willing to be whatever I needed him to be. The truth is, I started to see him differently during those long phone conversations and text exchanges. Not because I was suddenly attracted to him. Let's be real, Alexander was still the same basic guy he'd always been. But because I was tired. Tired of games, tired of disappointment, tired of starting over with new people who didn't really know me. Alexander knew everything about me, accepted everything about me, and had proven his loyalty over decades. I began hinting that maybe we should explore something more than friendship, testing the waters to see how he'd respond. Part of me expected him to jump at the chance. After all, isn't this what he'd wanted for 20 years? But Alexander seemed hesitant, almost cautious, which honestly irritated me. Here I was, finally considering giving him what he'd always claimed to want, and he was acting like he needed to think about it. Look, I know how this sounds. I know it seems like I was only interested in Alexander when my other options had dried up. But that's not entirely fair. I was genuinely trying to see if we could build something real together. The problem was that Alexander had apparently spent those 8 years growing a backbone and developing standards. When I suggested we take our relationship to the next level, he actually had the nerve to tell me he wasn't sure if that's what he wanted anymore. The rejection stung more than I expected. After years of having Alexander as my constant admirer, having him suddenly act like I wasn't good enough felt like a slap in the face. I found myself getting more aggressive in my pursuit, reminding him of our history together, pointing out how well we knew each other, emphasizing all the ways we were compatible. I even opened up about my health issues and how they'd changed my perspective on what I wanted in life. But Alexander remained frustratingly unmoved. He'd listened to everything I said with that same patient attention he'd always given me, but then he'd deflect or change the subject. It was like he'd built this wall between us that I couldn't break through, and it was driving me crazy. This was supposed to be easy. I was finally ready to give him what he'd always wanted, and he was acting like it was some kind of burden. The more he pulled away, the more desperate I became. I started showing up at places I knew he'd be, engineering coincidental meetings, and being more obvious about my interest. I told him flat out that I thought we'd be perfect together, that I'd finally realized what I'd been missing all these years. But Alexander just kept giving me these polite, non-committal responses that made me want to scream. The final blow came when Alexander actually sat me down and explained that he wasn't interested in pursuing a romantic relationship with me. He was kind about it, but firm. He said too much time had passed, that we wanted different things, that he didn't think we were compatible in the ways that mattered. He even had the audacity to suggest that maybe I was only interested in him now because my other options had become limited. I wanted to argue with him, to explain that he was wrong, that I genuinely cared about him and saw potential in our relationship. But the way he looked at me, with pity rather than love, made it clear that ship had sailed. Alexander had moved on from his feelings for me, and there was nothing I could say or do to bring them back. The safety net I'd counted on for decades was gone, and I was falling with nowhere to land. The months that followed were brutal. Alexander maintained polite contact but kept clear boundaries that hadn't existed before. He was pleasant but distant, friendly but unavailable. I tried to accept his decision gracefully, but inside I was seething. How dare he reject me after years of making me feel like I was the center of his universe? How dare he act like I wasn't good enough when he'd spent decades proving that I was everything he wanted? I found myself obsessing over what had changed, what I'd done wrong, what I could have done differently. I replayed every conversation we'd had since reconnecting, looking for clues about when he'd stopped seeing me as relationship material. The worst part was that I couldn't even be angry with him publicly. After all, I was the one who'd friend-zoned him for 20 years. Everyone would just see his rejection as justified karma. But here's what really gets me. Alexander didn't just reject me, he completely rewrote our entire history. Suddenly he was acting like our friendship had been this equal, platonic thing, instead of acknowledging that he'd spent years trying to win me over. He conveniently forgot all the times he'd hinted at wanting more, all the ways he'd gone above and beyond what a normal friend would do, all the obvious signs that he was in love with me. A year later, I heard through mutual friends that Alexander was seeing someone new. Not just dating casually, but in a serious relationship with someone he'd met through work. I managed to get a look at her social media, and she was fine. Pretty enough, seemed nice, nothing special. Certainly nothing I couldn't compete with, if Alexander had given me a real chance. The thing that really bothers me is how easily Alexander moved on. After claiming to have feelings for me for decades, he just stopped. Like I meant nothing. Like all those years of friendship and emotional intimacy were just practice for the real thing with someone else. I gave him the best years of my life as a friend, supported him through everything, and this is how he repays me? I know people probably think I got what I deserved, that this is some kind of cosmic justice for keeping Alexander in the friend zone for so long. But they don't understand how complicated the situation really was. I never asked him to wait for me. I never promised him anything. I was just being a good friend to someone who needed me, and when I finally opened myself up to the possibility of something more, he threw it back in my face. Now I'm completely alone, and Alexander is living his happy little life with someone who doesn't know him like I do, who wasn't there for him during his awkward years, who didn't help shape him into the man he became. She gets to benefit from all the emotional work I put into our relationship, without having to earn it. Meanwhile, I'm starting over at 36 with health issues that limit my options and no safety net to fall back on. The worst part is that I can't even hate Alexander properly because part of me knows he's right. I did only consider him seriously when my other options dried up. I did take his devotion for granted for years. I did assume he'd always be there waiting for me, no matter how long it took me to come around. But knowing that doesn't make the rejection hurt any less or make my current situation any easier to bear. 2 years have passed since Alexander's final rejection, and I'm still dealing with the aftermath. My health issues have gotten worse, severely limiting my dating prospects and my ability to have the family I always thought I'd eventually want. The men who are interested in me now are either damaged goods themselves or looking for something casual that doesn't require real commitment. I'm too old and too complicated for the kind of relationship I actually want. Alexander, meanwhile, got engaged to his girlfriend after dating her for just 18 months. 18 months to get what I couldn't get in 20 years of friendship. I saw the announcement on social media, and it felt like a knife to the gut. Not because I'm still in love with him, I'm not sure I ever really was, but because it proved that everything he told me about not being ready for a relationship was complete garbage. He just wasn't ready for a relationship with me. The engagement photos showed Alexander looking happier than I'd ever seen him. Confident, successful, genuinely content in a way that made me realize he'd never looked at me like that, even during our closest moments. I'd always assumed his feelings for me were the deepest thing he'd ever experienced. but apparently, I was just a stepping stone to something better. I tried to be happy for him, I really did. I sent a congratulatory message that he responded to politely but briefly. No invitation to the wedding, no attempt to maintain even a superficial friendship. After 2 decades of being supposedly important to each other, I'd been completely erased from his life. It was like I'd never mattered at all. The reality hit me then that I'd completely misunderstood our entire relationship. I thought Alexander's devotion to me was this deep, unchangeable thing that would always be there when I needed it. I thought I was special to him in a way that couldn't be replicated with anyone else. But I was wrong. I was just practice. I was the training wheels he needed before he learned to ride the real bike. Now I'm alone with my health problems and my regrets, watching from the sidelines as Alexander builds the life I could have had if I'd been smarter, if I'd recognized what was right in front of me, if I'd been brave enough to take a chance on something real, instead of always chasing the excitement that inevitably faded. The safety net I'd counted on for so long had been quietly removed, and I was too busy looking elsewhere to notice until it was too late to matter. I can't even blame Alexander for moving on. I had my chance, multiple chances actually, and I chose to keep him as my backup plan instead of my priority. But understanding why he left doesn't make being left behind any easier. I'm starting over at an age when most people are settling down, with complications that make me less desirable than I used to be, and no guarantee that I'll ever find someone who'll love me the way Alexander used to. The one person who truly knew me and accepted everything about me is gone, and it's entirely my fault for taking him for granted until it was too late to fix.